Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 7 deeply disturbing, true road trip horror stories that will make you question every journey you take beyond familiar territory. These are not fictional tales designed to thrill, but authentic encounters shared by ordinary travelers who found themselves facing the darkest aspects of human nature and the unexplained on America's highways and backroads. Each story in this episode has been meticulously compiled from first-hand accounts and corroborated wherever possible through law enforcement records and witness statements. The open road promises freedom and adventure, but it also conceals dangers that most people never anticipate until it is too late. If you value genuine horror content that respects the gravity of real experiences and refuses to sensationalize tragedy, subscribe to Buried Files and hit the notification bell, so our next investigation into verified accounts reaches you the moment it drops. After you hear these harrowing stories, share your own encounters or thoughts in the comments below, because sometimes the most terrifying truth is that these things happen to people just like us. Now settle in as we explore what happens when the road takes a dark turn and help is nowhere to be found. Earl had driven the same interstate route for 15 years without incident. He considered himself an experienced traveler who knew every rest stop, every shortcut, and every reliable gas station between Pennsylvania and Colorado. The journey had become so routine that he could almost drive it in his sleep. And in those 15 years, the worst thing that had ever happened to him was a flat tire outside of Kansas City. That confidence, that sense of invincibility that comes from doing something over and over without consequence, made him dismiss the warning signs when his GPS stopped working near the New Mexico state line. By the time he realized something was wrong, 3 vehicles had boxed him in on an empty stretch of highway, and the men stepping out of those trucks were not there to offer roadside assistance. Earl was making his annual trip to visit his daughter Rebecca in Denver. She had moved out there 5 years earlier for work and had recently given birth to his first grandchild. Earl had been counting down the days until he could meet little Emma, and nothing was going to stop him from getting there on time. He had left Pittsburgh early on a Wednesday morning, driving through Ohio and Indiana without stopping for more than gas and bathroom breaks. By the time evening rolled around, he was deep into rural New Mexico, taking back roads to avoid the congestion on the main interstate. The sun had set an hour earlier, and the darkness out here was absolute. No streetlights, no houses, no other vehicles. Just his headlights cutting through the black and the occasional reflective mile marker catching the light. Earl had his radio tuned to a classic rock station, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel to the rhythm of an old Eagles song. Everything felt normal. Everything felt safe. Around midnight, Earl noticed his fuel gauge creeping toward empty. He had planned to fill up at a truck stop another 30 miles down the road. But when he checked his GPS for confirmation, the screen showed nothing but a blank map with a spinning loading icon. He tapped the screen a few times, then tried rebooting the device, but it refused to cooperate. Earl muttered a curse under his breath and decided to rely on memory. He was certain the truck stop was just ahead. 10 minutes passed, then 20. No truck stop appeared. Earl started to worry. The fuel gauge needle was now firmly in the red zone, and the low fuel warning light had been glowing for the past 5 minutes. He began scanning the darkness for any sign of civilization, any lights that might indicate a gas station or even a farmhouse where he could ask for directions. But there was nothing. Just endless black highway stretching into the void. Then, like an answer to a prayer, Earl saw lights ahead. Not the bright, fluorescent glow of a gas station, but the dimmer lights of what appeared to be a small truck stop or rest area. As he got closer, he could make out a single building with a few pumps out front and a flickering neon sign that read, gas and food. It looked run down, almost abandoned, but beggars could not be choosers. Earl pulled in, relieved that he would not be stranded on this desolate stretch of highway. The parking lot was empty except for a dark blue pickup truck parked near the far edge, away from the lights. Earl pulled up to one of the pumps and turned off his engine. The sudden silence was eerie. No other traffic sounds, no wind, nothing. Just the faint hum of the neon sign and the ticking of his cooling engine. Earl stepped out of his car and stretched, feeling the stiffness in his back from hours of driving. He swiped his credit card at the pump and began fueling up, glancing around the lot as he did. That was when he noticed the man in the pickup truck. The vehicle was maybe 50 feet away, parked at an odd angle as if the driver had pulled in hastily and decided to stay. The engine was running. Earl could see the faint glow of dashboard lights through the windshield, and he could just barely make out the silhouette of someone sitting behind the wheel. The man was not moving, not getting out to pump gas or use the restroom, just sitting there, watching. Earl felt a prickle of unease run down his spine, but he pushed it aside. Maybe the guy was taking a phone call or waiting for someone. Nothing sinister about that. Earl finished pumping his gas, replaced the nozzle, and got back in his car. He started the engine and pulled out of the lot, eager to put some distance between himself and that strange, motionless figure. He merged back onto the highway and accelerated, settling back into his seat. The radio station had faded into static, so he switched it off and drove in silence. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Earl checked his mirrors out of habit and felt his stomach drop. Headlights. A single vehicle, maybe a quarter-mile back, keeping pace with him. Earl told himself it was just another traveler heading in the same direction. Plenty of people drove this route at night. But as the minutes ticked by, the vehicle never got closer and never fell farther behind. It maintained the exact same distance, matching his speed perfectly. Earl tested his theory by slowing down to 60 miles per hour. The vehicle behind him slowed down too. Earl sped up to 75. The headlights sped up as well. Earl felt his heart rate increase. He gripped the steering wheel tighter and stared at the rearview mirror, trying to make out details of the vehicle behind him. It looked like a pickup truck, a dark one, just like the one at the gas station. Fear crept into Earl's mind, irrational and insistent. He tried to convince himself that he was being paranoid, that there was no reason to think the truck was following him. But the longer it stayed there, matching his every move, the harder it became to dismiss. Earl considered pulling over to let the truck pass, but something told him that would be a mistake. What if the driver pulled over too? What if this deserted stretch of highway was exactly where the driver wanted him to stop? Earl kept driving. His hands were sweating now, and his breathing had become shallow. He searched the darkness ahead for any sign of help, any place he could turn off where there might be other people. But there was nothing. Just mile after mile of empty road. Then the truck accelerated. It closed the distance between them in seconds, its headlights flooding Earl's mirrors with blinding white light. Earl squinted and adjusted the rearview mirror, but the glare was overwhelming. The truck pulled up close behind him, so close that Earl could no longer see its front bumper. It was tailgating him aggressively now, and Earl could feel the panic rising in his chest. He pressed down harder on the gas pedal, pushing his sedan up to 80 miles per hour. The truck stayed with him. Earl went faster. 85, 90. The truck did not fall back. Earl's car was not built for high-speed chases, and the engine began to protest, the steering wheel vibrating under his hands. He knew he could not keep this up for long. Then, without warning, the truck pulled into the left lane and began to come alongside him. Earl's breath caught in his throat. He glanced to his left and saw the truck pulling even with his driver's side window. The windows of the truck were tinted, but Earl could just make out the shape of the driver. A man, large, wearing a dark jacket. The man turned his head to look at Earl, and even though Earl could not see his face clearly, he could feel the menace radiating from him. The driver gestured violently, pointing toward the shoulder of the road. He wanted Earl to pull over. Earl shook his head and kept driving, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The truck stayed alongside him, the driver gesturing more aggressively now. Earl felt trapped. If he slowed down, the truck could force him off the road. If he sped up, the truck would just speed up too. And there was nowhere to turn, no exits, no help in sight. Then Earl saw something ahead. Lights, bright lights, a checkpoint. Earl could have cried with relief. It was a state police checkpoint, one of those random stops they set up to check for drunk drivers or expired registrations. There were 3 patrol cars parked on the shoulder, their blue and red lights flashing in the darkness. 2 officers stood in the road with flashlights, waving down vehicles. The moment the truck driver saw the checkpoint, he hit the brakes. The truck fell back behind Earl and then suddenly swerved onto the shoulder, kicking up a cloud of dust and gravel. Earl watched in his mirror as the truck made a sharp U-turn and disappeared back the way they had come, speeding off into the night. Earl slowed down and pulled up to the checkpoint. One of the officers approached his window, shining a flashlight into the car. Earl rolled down the window, and the officer asked for his license and registration. Earl's hands were still shaking as he pulled out his wallet. The officer noticed immediately. He asked Earl if he was all right, and Earl poured out the entire story. The gas station, the truck, the pursuit, the aggressive tailgating, the gestures to pull over. The officer's expression grew serious. He called over his partner, and Earl repeated the story. The second officer radioed it in, and within minutes, another patrol car was dispatched to search for the truck. The officers told Earl that he was not the first to report a similar incident. Over the past month, at least 3 other drivers had described being followed by a dark pickup truck on this same stretch of highway. 2 of those drivers had been forced off the road and robbed at gunpoint. 1 had been badly beaten. The police suspected it was a coordinated robbery operation, with the truck targeting solo drivers late at night when there were no witnesses. Earl felt sick. He had come so close to becoming another victim. If it had not been for the checkpoint, if the timing had been just slightly different, he might have been forced off the road and left stranded in the desert. Or worse. The officers took down all of Earl's information and assured him they would do everything they could to find the truck. They offered to escort him to the next town, but Earl declined. He just wanted to keep moving, to get as far away from this place as possible. The officers wished him a safe trip and told him to call if he saw the truck again. Earl drove for another 2 hours before stopping at a well-lit motel on the outskirts of Albuquerque. He checked in, locked the door behind him, and collapsed onto the bed. He called his daughter and told her what had happened. She begged him to take a day to rest before continuing the drive, but Earl refused. He would leave first thing in the morning and finish the trip in daylight. He was not going to let fear stop him from meeting his granddaughter. But sleep did not come easily that night. Every time Earl closed his eyes, he saw the headlights in his rearview mirror. Every sound outside his window made him sit up, heart pounding, wondering if the truck had found him. He kept the curtains drawn and the door double-locked, and he barely slept at all. The next morning, Earl got back on the road. He drove straight through to Denver without stopping except for gas at crowded truck stops where there were plenty of other people around. When he finally arrived at his daughter's house, he hugged her tighter than he had in years. He held baby Emma in his arms and felt the fear from the previous night begin to fade, replaced by gratitude that he had made it safely. But the experience changed Earl. He never drove that route at night again. He planned his trips carefully, always making sure to stop before dark and stay in well-populated areas. He kept his phone charged and his tank full. And whenever he saw a dark pickup truck on the highway, his heart would skip a beat and he would watch it carefully until it passed by or turned off. Earl never found out if the police caught the men in the truck. He followed the news for a few weeks afterward, but saw nothing. Maybe they moved on to another state, another stretch of highway. Maybe they were caught eventually. Or maybe they are still out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to pull into that lonely gas station in the middle of nowhere. Betty and her sister Mabel had been planning this trip for months. After years of living in different states and only seeing each other during holidays, they finally decided to take a proper road trip together like they used to when they were younger. Betty lived in Phoenix, and Mabel had flown in from California for a 2-week visit. The plan was simple: drive from Arizona to Texas to visit their elderly aunt who was celebrating her 85th birthday. It was supposed to be a leisurely journey with stops at roadside attractions and small-town diners along the way. They left Phoenix early on a Saturday morning, Betty behind the wheel of her 8-year-old Honda sedan. The car had always been reliable, never giving her any serious problems beyond routine maintenance. Betty had gotten an oil change the week before and checked the tires and fluids herself. Everything seemed perfect for the journey ahead. The first few hours of the drive went smoothly. They chatted about their lives, caught up on family gossip, and sang along to oldies on the radio. By mid-afternoon, they were approaching the Arizona-New Mexico border. Betty had been following the main highway, but Mabel, who had been studying the map on her phone, suggested they take an alternate route. Mabel explained that according to her GPS app, there was a smaller highway that cut through the desert and would save them almost an hour of driving time. The route looked straightforward on the map, a clean line connecting 2 points. Betty was hesitant at first. She preferred sticking to major highways where services were plentiful and help was never far away. But Mabel insisted that it would be fine, that the app had thousands of reviews and was highly rated for accuracy. Against her better judgment, Betty agreed. They took the next exit and headed south on a 2-lane highway that quickly became more remote than either of them had anticipated. The landscape changed from scattered towns and gas stations to pure desert. Scrub brush, red rock formations, and endless sand stretched in every direction. The road itself was in decent condition, but they had not passed another vehicle in over 20 minutes. About 40 minutes into this detour, Betty noticed something wrong. The temperature gauge on her dashboard had crept into the warning zone. She pointed it out to Mabel, and both women watched with growing concern as the needle continued to climb. Betty eased off the gas, hoping that reducing speed would help. But the gauge kept rising. Then came the sound. A low grinding noise from under the hood, followed by a high-pitched squeal. Betty felt her stomach drop. She had heard that sound once before, years ago, right before her previous car had died on the side of the road. She told Mabel they needed to find a place to pull over immediately. But there was nowhere to pull over. The shoulder was narrow and uneven, dropping off into steep, sandy ditches on both sides. Betty kept driving, searching desperately for a wider spot or a turnoff. The grinding noise grew louder, and steam began to pour from under the hood. The car started to shudder. Betty had no choice. She pulled over as far as she could on the narrow shoulder and turned off the engine. The moment she did, the car gave a final shudder and went silent. The two women sat there for a moment, staring at each other in disbelief. Betty tried turning the key. Nothing. The engine would not even turn over. It was completely dead. Betty popped the hood and got out to inspect the damage. She was not a mechanic, but even she could see that something catastrophic had happened. Fluid was leaking from somewhere under the engine, pooling on the hot pavement and evaporating into steam. The smell of burning oil filled the air. Whatever had broken, it was not something they could fix on the side of the road. Mabel pulled out her phone to call for roadside assistance. No signal. She walked a few yards in each direction, holding her phone up high, searching for even one bar of service. Nothing. Betty tried her phone as well. Same result. They were stranded in the middle of the desert with no cell service and no way to call for help. Betty looked around, trying to assess their situation. The sun was still high in the sky, so they had maybe 3 or 4 hours of daylight left. They had not passed any buildings or turnoffs for miles. Behind them, the road stretched empty into the distance. Ahead, more of the same. Not a single vehicle had passed since they pulled over. Mabel suggested they start walking. There had to be a town, or at least a house somewhere up ahead. But Betty was reluctant. It was at least 95 degrees outside, and they had only brought 1 bottle of water, which was already half empty. Walking in this heat without proper supplies could be dangerous. Better to stay with the car where they had shade and wait for someone to drive by. So they waited. 30 minutes passed. Then an hour. No vehicles appeared in either direction. The desert was utterly silent, except for the occasional gust of wind. Betty tried the ignition again, hoping that maybe the engine had just overheated and would start after cooling down. Still nothing. As the sun began to sink lower on the horizon, both women started to feel genuine fear. What if no one drove this route until tomorrow? What if they were stuck out here overnight with no food, no water, and no way to stay warm once the desert temperature dropped? Then, just as desperation was really setting in, Betty saw something in her side mirror. Headlights. A vehicle was approaching from behind them. Relief flooded through her. She and Mabel both stepped out of the car and began waving their arms. The vehicle slowed as it approached. It was a white van, older model, with tinted windows and rust spots along the bottom panels. The van pulled up behind their car and stopped. The engine idled for a moment, and then the driver's door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, maybe in his 40s, wearing jeans and a faded t-shirt. He had a beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Betty called out a greeting, explaining that their car had broken down and asking if he could give them a ride to the nearest town, or at least let them use his phone. The man did not respond right away. He just stood there, looking at them. Then the passenger door opened, and a second man got out. This one was shorter, stockier, with a shaved head and tattoos running down both arms. Something about the way the two men looked at them made Betty uneasy. There was no friendliness in their expressions, no concern. Just a cold, calculating assessment. The first man walked slowly toward them, not hurrying, taking his time. He asked what was wrong with the car. Betty explained about the engine failure. The man nodded and walked over to look under the hood. While he was examining the engine, the second man circled around to the passenger side of Betty's car and peered through the windows. He was looking at their belongings, their purses, their luggage in the back seat. Mabel stepped closer to Betty. and whispered that something did not feel right. Betty agreed. Every instinct was screaming at her to be careful. The first man closed the hood and turned back to them. He said the car was not going anywhere without a tow truck. Then he offered them a ride. But the way he said it did not sound like an offer. It sounded like a statement, like it was already decided. Betty forced a smile and said they would be fine, that they had already called for roadside assistance and help was on the way. It was a lie, but she hoped it would make the men leave. The first man stared at her for a long moment, then looked at Mabel. He said he had not seen them on any phones. He said it looked like they were stranded with no help coming. The second man walked back around to join them. He stood close, too close, invading their personal space. He asked if they were sure they did not want to ride. His tone was not friendly. It was threatening. Mabel stepped back toward the car. Betty could see the fear in her sister's eyes. She tried to keep her voice steady as she insisted they were fine and that they did not need any help. But the men did not leave. They just stood there, blocking the space between the women and their car. Then the first man pulled something from his pocket, a crowbar. He held it casually, almost lazily, tapping it against his palm. He said they seemed like they might need some convincing. He took a step toward them. Betty's heart was pounding. She glanced at Mabel, then back at the men. They were trapped. The desert stretched empty in all directions. No one was coming to help them, and these men clearly had no good intentions. In that moment, Betty made a decision. She turned and lunged for the driver's door of her car. She yanked it open and threw herself inside, hitting the lock button as Mabel dove into the passenger seat. The second man grabbed Mabel's door handle, but the lock engaged just in time. He yanked on it, but it held. The first man ran to Betty's side and raised the crowbar. He brought it down hard on the window. The glass held, but spiderweb cracks spread across it. He raised the crowbar again. Betty turned the key in the ignition. She prayed harder than she had ever prayed in her life. The engine sputtered. The man brought the crowbar down again, and this time the window shattered, glass spraying across Betty's lap. She screamed and turned the key again. The engine caught. It roared to life. Betty slammed the car into drive and stomped on the gas. The car lurched forward, scraping against the van as it pulled away. The second man jumped back to avoid being hit. Betty could hear him shouting, hear their footsteps as they ran back to their van. The car was shaking violently, and smoke was pouring from under the hood again. But it was moving. Betty pushed the accelerator to the floor, willing the car to keep going. In the rearview mirror, she saw the van pull out onto the road and start after them. Mabel was crying, holding onto the dashboard as the car rattled and groaned. Betty focused on the road ahead, searching desperately for any sign of help. The engine was making terrible sounds, and the temperature gauge was maxed out. But she could not stop. If she stopped, those men would catch them. They drove for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 or 6 minutes. Then Betty saw lights ahead. Buildings. A town. She nearly sobbed with relief. The van was still behind them. But as they entered the town and other vehicles appeared on the road, the van slowed and then turned off down a side street. Betty pulled into the parking lot of a gas station and killed the engine. It rattled one final time and then died for good. She and Mabel sat there, shaking, covered in glass and sweat. A gas station attendant came running out, asking if they were okay. Betty could barely speak. Mabel managed to explain what had happened. The attendant called the police. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars arrived. Betty and Mabel gave their statements, describing the men and the van. The officers told them that stretch of highway had been the site of several assaults and robberies over the past year. Women traveling alone were frequently targeted. The police had been trying to catch the perpetrators for months. Betty later learned that the car trouble had not been entirely accidental. Investigators found that the fuel line had been contaminated, likely at a gas station about 50 miles back. It was a tactic used by criminals to disable vehicles in remote areas, making victims easy targets. The men in the van had probably been watching and waiting for the car to break down. Betty and Mabel never took that route again. They rented a car to finish their trip and stayed on major highways the entire way. The experience left them both shaken, but also grateful. They had escaped. Others had not been so lucky. Howard had always considered himself a practical man. He was an accountant by trade, someone who dealt in numbers and facts and concrete reality. He did not believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena. He had never experienced anything in his 43 years that could not be explained by logic and reason. That certainty made what happened to him on a rural Virginia back road all the more disturbing, because to this day, he cannot explain what he saw. It was late October, and Howard was driving home from a 3-day business conference in Richmond. The conference had run longer than expected, and by the time Howard checked out of his hotel and loaded his car, it was already past 9 in the evening. He had a 6-hour drive ahead of him back to his home in Pennsylvania, and he debated whether to stay another night and leave fresh in the morning. But he was tired of being away from home, tired of hotel rooms and conference halls, and he just wanted to sleep in his own bed. A colleague at the conference had mentioned a shortcut that would save about 40 minutes off the drive. Instead of taking the main interstate north, this route cut through rural Virginia on a series of smaller highways and country roads. The colleague swore by it, saying he used it every time he made the trip. Howard programmed the route into his GPS and set off. The first hour went smoothly. The roads were well maintained, and though there was not much traffic, Howard saw enough other vehicles to feel comfortable. But as he got deeper into rural Virginia, the roads became narrower and more winding. The trees pressed in close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out the moonlight. Howard's headlights were the only illumination, cutting through the darkness in narrow beams. Around 11 o'clock, Howard's GPS directed him onto an even smaller road. This one was barely 2 lanes wide, with no center line painted and no reflective markers along the edges. The pavement was cracked and uneven, and Howard had to slow down to navigate the sharp curves. He had not seen another vehicle in over 20 minutes, and the GPS showed no towns or services anywhere nearby. Howard was starting to regret taking this shortcut. He considered turning around and heading back to the main highway, but the GPS indicated he was more than halfway through the route. It would take just as long to go back as it would to continue forward. So he pressed on, gripping the steering wheel tightly and focusing on the road ahead. That was when he saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. Howard's foot hit the brake instinctively, and the car slowed to a crawl. His headlights illuminated the figure clearly. It was a person, standing perfectly still, about 100 feet ahead. As Howard got closer, more details became visible. The figure appeared to be a man, tall and thin, wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothing: dark trousers, a white shirt, and a jacket that seemed out of place for the era. The style reminded Howard of photographs from the 1940s or 50s. But what struck Howard most was the complete stillness. The figure was not moving at all, not shifting weight from one foot to the other, not looking around, not even appearing to breathe. Just standing there, facing Howard's approaching car. Howard stopped about 50 feet away, leaving the engine running. He waited, expecting the person to move, to step aside, to acknowledge his presence somehow. But nothing happened. The figure remained motionless, arms at its sides, staring straight ahead. Howard felt a chill run through him, despite the warm air blowing from the car's heater. Something was wrong. Every instinct told him this was not a normal situation. But what was he supposed to do? He could not just drive around the figure. The shoulders on both sides of the road dropped off into deep ditches, and there was no room to maneuver. He would have to back up and find another route, or convince this person to move. Howard rolled down his window and called out. His voice sounded too loud in the silent night. He asked if the person needed help, if everything was all right. No response. The figure did not even turn its head. Howard called out again, louder this time. Still nothing. Frustrated and increasingly unnerved, Howard honked his horn. The sound echoed through the trees, harsh and jarring. But the figure remained motionless. Howard honked again, longer this time. Nothing. Howard's hands were shaking now. This was not normal behavior. No rational person would stand in the middle of a dark road, blocking traffic, and completely ignore someone trying to communicate with them. Maybe the person was drunk or on drugs. Maybe they were having some kind of medical emergency. Or maybe, a small voice in Howard's mind whispered, maybe this was not a person at all. Howard shook his head, trying to dispel that thought. Of course it was a person. What else could it be? He was just tired and letting his imagination run wild. He decided to try one more thing. He flashed his high beams, hoping the bright light would get a reaction. The figure vanished. Howard blinked, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him. But no, the figure was gone, completely disappeared. The road ahead was empty, illuminated clearly by his high beams. There was nowhere the person could have gone so quickly. No side roads, no buildings, no cover of any kind. The figure had simply ceased to exist. Howard sat frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. People do not just disappear. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the person had jumped into the ditch. Maybe Howard had not seen them move because he was momentarily blinded by the high beams. That had to be it. But then Howard caught movement in his peripheral vision. His blood turned to ice. He turned his head slowly to the left and looked out the driver's side window. The figure was standing right there, right next to his car, less than a foot away from the window, staring in at him. Howard could see it clearly now in the glow of his dashboard lights. It was a man, or something that looked like a man. The face was pale, unnaturally so, with sunken cheeks and dark hollows where the eyes should be. The expression was completely blank, emotionless. And those eyes, if they could be called eyes, were looking directly at Howard with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Howard screamed. He did not think about it, did not try to control his reaction. Pure terror took over. He slammed his foot down on the accelerator, and the car lurched forward with a screech of tires. He did not look back, did not check his mirrors, just drove as fast as he dared on that narrow, winding road. His heart was hammering in his chest, and his breathing came in short, panicked gasps. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles were white. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. That thing, that figure, it had moved from the middle of the road to beside his car in an instant, without making a sound, without Howard seeing it move. Howard drove for 20 minutes straight without slowing down, taking curves too fast and praying he would not lose control. Finally, he saw lights ahead, a gas station. Never in his life had Howard been so relieved to see fluorescent lighting and a parking lot. He pulled in and parked directly under the brightest light he could find. His hands were still shaking as he turned off the engine. He sat there for several minutes, trying to calm down, trying to convince himself that what he had experienced was not real. Maybe he had fallen asleep at the wheel for a moment and dreamed the whole thing. Maybe he was more exhausted than he thought and had hallucinated. But it had felt so real. The figure, the clothes, the face, the way it had stared at him through the window. Howard could still see those hollow eyes when he closed his own. He got out of the car on unsteady legs and walked into the gas station. A young attendant was behind the counter, scrolling through his phone. He looked up as Howard entered and immediately seemed concerned. He asked Howard if he was all right. Howard must have looked as shaken as he felt. Howard asked for some water and then, hesitantly, described what had happened. The attendant's expression changed from concern to something else. Recognition, maybe, or fear. He asked Howard which road he had been on. Howard told him. The attendant nodded slowly and said that Howard was not the first person to report something like that. According to the attendant, multiple drivers had described seeing a figure on that particular stretch of road over the past few months. Some saw it standing in the road. Others saw it walking along the shoulder. A few, like Howard, reported seeing it appear right next to their vehicle. No one could explain it. Police had investigated, but found nothing. No evidence of anyone living in the area, no explanation for the sightings. The attendant pulled up something on his phone and showed it to Howard. It was a local news article from 2 months earlier. A woman had called police claiming she had nearly hit a man standing in the road. When officers arrived to investigate, they found no one. But they did find records of a fatal accident on that same road in 1968. A man had been struck and killed by a vehicle late at night. The driver had fled the scene, and the case was never solved. Howard felt sick. He asked the attendant if he thought what people were seeing was a ghost. The attendant shrugged. He said he did not know what it was, but whatever it was, it had scared enough people that locals avoided that road after dark. Howard thanked the attendant and bought a large coffee. He asked for directions to the main highway and wrote them down carefully. There was no way he was going back the way he had come. He did not care how much longer it took. He was sticking to well-lit, well-traveled roads for the rest of the trip. As Howard got back in his car and prepared to leave, he noticed something on his driver's side window. A handprint. A pale, smudged handprint right where the figure had been standing. Howard felt his stomach drop. He had not touched the outside of that window. No one had, except for the figure. Howard grabbed a napkin from his glove compartment and frantically wiped away the handprint. He did not want to see it, did not want to be reminded. He pulled out of the gas station and drove straight to the main highway, following the attendant's directions exactly. The rest of the drive passed without incident. But Howard could not shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed menacing. Every reflection in his mirrors made him jump. By the time he finally pulled into his driveway at 3 a.m, he was exhausted and emotionally drained. Howard never told his wife the full story. He said the conference had run late and traffic was bad. She did not need to know what had really happened. Howard himself spent weeks trying to rationalize the experience. He researched sleep deprivation and hallucinations. He considered seeing a doctor to make sure nothing was wrong with his brain. But he could not explain the handprint. And he could not explain how the gas station attendant and others had seen the same figure. Whatever Howard had encountered on that road, It was not a product of his imagination. It was real, in some way that defied logical explanation. Howard never drove through rural Virginia at night again. And sometimes, late at night when he cannot sleep, he wonders about the figure. Is it still out there, standing in the middle of that dark road, waiting for the next traveler to come along? And what does it want? Howard does not have answers. He only has the memory of those hollow eyes staring at him through the window, and the certainty that some things in this world cannot be explained by facts and logic alone. Frank and his wife Agnes had been married for 32 years, and in all that time they had made it a tradition to take at least one road trip together each year. They had explored most of the country, from the beaches of California to the mountains of Maine. This particular autumn, they decided to drive through the Appalachian region, taking back roads through small towns and enjoying the fall foliage. They had left their home in North Carolina early on a Thursday morning with no fixed itinerary. The plan was to wander, stopping wherever looked interesting and spending nights at small bed and breakfasts or family-owned motels. It was the kind of leisurely, unstructured travel they both loved. By late afternoon, they found themselves on a winding mountain road somewhere in eastern Kentucky. The GPS had lost signal about an hour earlier, but Frank was not concerned. He had an old paper map in the glove compartment, and they were in no hurry. Agnes was dozing in the passenger seat, and Frank was content to drive in peaceful silence. Around 6 in the evening, Frank noticed they were running low on gas. He had not seen a gas station in quite some time, and the needle was creeping toward the empty. Agnes woke up and suggested they find a town soon. Frank agreed, scanning the roadside for any signs indicating services ahead. 10 minutes later, they crested a hill and saw a small town in the valley below. It was not much, maybe a dozen buildings clustered around a single main street. But Frank could make out what looked like a gas station and a few shops. Perfect. They would fill up the tank, grab dinner at a local diner if there was one, and then continue on to find lodging for the night. Frank drove down into the town and immediately noticed how quiet it was. There were no other vehicles on the road, no people walking on the sidewalks. Every building looked old but maintained, like the town had been frozen in time somewhere around the 1970s. Frank pulled up to the gas station, which had old-fashioned pumps and a hand-painted sign advertising prices that seemed impossibly low. He got out and tried the pump. It was locked. Frank looked around for an attendant, but saw no one. There was a small building that appeared to be the station office, but the windows were dark. Frank knocked on the door. No answer. He tried the handle. Locked. Agnes got out of the car and looked around. She commented on how strange it was that the town seemed completely deserted. Frank agreed. It was dinner time on a Thursday evening. There should be people around, lights on in houses, cars parked on the street. But there was nothing, just silence. Frank suggested they try finding someone who could help. Maybe everyone was at some kind of community event. They walked toward what looked like the main street, their footsteps echoing off the empty buildings. The first structure they passed was a general store. Frank peered through the window. The interior was dimly lit by natural light, and he could see shelves stocked with goods. But no people. The door was locked. They continued down the street, trying doors and looking in windows. Every building was the same, locked up tight, but showing signs of recent use. A barber shop with magazines dated from the current year sitting on the counter. A hardware store with a calendar turned to the correct month. A small library with books arranged neatly on shelves. But absolutely no people anywhere. Agnes was getting nervous. She said they should leave and find another town. But Frank was curious now, and also concerned about the gas situation. They needed to find someone who could help them. He spotted what looked like a diner at the end of the street and suggested they try there. The diner had a neon sign in the window that read, "Open," though the neon was not lit. Frank tried the door. It swung open. Finally, something unlocked. They stepped inside, and Agnes called out a greeting. No response. The diner looked like any small-town restaurant. Red vinyl booths, a long counter with stools, a jukebox in the corner. Everything was clean and orderly. There were even plates of food sitting on some of the tables, as if people had been eating and then suddenly left. Frank walked over to one of the plates. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans. He reached out and touched the potatoes, still warm. Someone had been eating this meal very recently, within the last few minutes. But where had they gone? Agnes grabbed Frank's arm, her grip tight with fear. She pointed to the kitchen. The door was slightly ajar, and they could hear something. A faint sound, like breathing. Heavy, labored breathing. Frank called out, asking if anyone was there. The breathing stopped. Frank walked slowly toward the kitchen, Agnes staying close behind him. He pushed the door open wider and looked inside. The kitchen was empty. Pots on the stove, food in various stages of preparation, but no cook. Frank checked behind the counter, near the walk-in refrigerator. Nothing. Then they heard it again. The breathing. But it was not coming from the kitchen. It was coming from behind them. Frank and Agnes spun around. A man was sitting in one of the booths. He had not been there a moment ago. Frank was certain of it. But now there he was, sitting perfectly still, hands folded on the table in front of him, staring at them. Frank felt his heart rate increase. He tried to keep his voice steady as he greeted the man and explained that they needed to buy gas. The man did not respond. He just stared, his expression completely blank. No recognition, no acknowledgement, just that empty stare. Agnes tugged on Frank's sleeve, whispering that they needed to leave right now. Frank agreed. This whole situation was wrong. They backed toward the door, keeping their eyes on the man. He did not move, did not blink, just watched them retreat. As they reached the door, Frank noticed movement through the window. People were appearing on the street, not walking out of buildings, but simply appearing, as if materializing out of thin air. One moment the street was empty. The next, there were a dozen people standing motionless on the sidewalk. Frank and Agnes hurried out of the diner and toward their car. The people on the street turned to watch them. All of them had the same blank expression as the man in the diner. No emotion, no curiosity, just cold observation. And all of them were completely silent. No one spoke. No one made any sound at all. Frank and Agnes reached their car, and Frank fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. He dropped them and had to bend down to pick them up. When he stood back up, the people had moved closer. They were forming a loose circle around the car, still silent, still staring. Frank finally got the key in the lock and opened the door. Agnes jumped in the passenger side and immediately locked her door. Frank slid behind the wheel and locked his door. He started the engine, and the sound was shockingly loud in the oppressive silence. One of the men stepped forward and approached Frank's window. He was older, maybe in his 60s, wearing work clothes and a cap. He raised his hand and knocked on the window. Not a polite knock, but a hard, deliberate pounding. He gestured for Frank to roll down the window. Frank shook his head. The man knocked harder. Another person joined him, a woman this time. She also gestured for Frank to open the window. Then more people approached. They surrounded the car, pressing close, their faces almost touching the glass. Some were knocking, others were just standing there, staring with those empty eyes. Frank threw the car into reverse and hit the gas. The car lurched backward and the crowd scattered to avoid being hit. Frank spun the wheel, putting the car into drive, and accelerated toward the road out of town. In his rearview mirror, he could see the people standing in the middle of the street, watching them leave. Neither Frank nor Agnes spoke as they drove. Frank kept his foot pressed firmly on the gas pedal, pushing the car as fast as he dared on the winding mountain roads. The fuel gauge showed they were running on fumes, but he did not care. They had to get away from that town. They drove for 30 minutes, praying the gas would hold out. Finally, they saw lights ahead. A proper town with cars and traffic lights and people walking around normally. Frank pulled into the first gas station he saw and practically collapsed against the steering wheel with relief. While Frank filled the tank, Agnes went inside to use the restroom. When she came back out, she said she had asked the cashier about the town they had just left. She described the location as best she could. The cashier had looked at her strangely and said there was no town in that area. Nothing but abandoned mining operations and empty land. No one had lived there in decades. Agnes showed the cashier on a map where they had been. The cashier insisted she was mistaken. There was no town there. Frank and Agnes looked at each other. They knew what they had seen. They knew where they had been. But according to the cashier, and according to every map they checked afterward, that town did not exist. They reported the incident to local police, thinking perhaps they had stumbled onto some kind of cult or squatter settlement. The police took their statement, but seemed skeptical. An officer went to investigate the location they described, but found nothing. No town, no buildings, no people, just empty forest. Frank and Agnes continued their trip, but the experience had shaken them both deeply. They talked about it for weeks afterward, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had they taken a wrong turn into some isolated community that did not appear on maps? Had they experienced some kind of shared hallucination brought on by fatigue or carbon monoxide poisoning from a car leak? But none of those explanations felt right. What they had seen was too detailed, too consistent. The warm food in the diner, the recent dates on magazines and calendars, the people who appeared out of nowhere, and that terrible silence. Frank and Agnes never found that town again, though Frank admits he looked for it on subsequent trips through the area. Part of him wanted to prove it had been real, to find some concrete evidence. But the larger part of him was relieved when he found nothing. Some mysteries, he decided, are better left unsolved. Ralph and his friend Lester had known each other since high school. Now in their late 30s, they tried to take at least one road trip together each year, a tradition that helped them maintain their friendship despite living in different cities. This year they had planned a drive from Portland, Oregon to Las Vegas, Nevada, taking the scenic route through rural highways and stopping at various points of interest along the way. They left on a Friday morning in Ralph's truck, music playing, and both men looking forward to a week of adventure and catching up. The first day went smoothly. They drove through southern Oregon, admiring the landscape and stopping at a roadside diner for lunch. By late afternoon, they were crossing into Nevada on a remote stretch of highway that saw little traffic. Around 6 in the evening, Ralph suggested they stop at the next rest area to stretch their legs and use the facilities. They had been driving for nearly 5 hours straight, and both men were feeling stiff. Lester agreed, and 20 minutes later, they saw signs indicating a rest area 2 miles ahead. The rest area was small and basic. Just a parking lot, a cinder block building housing restrooms, and a few picnic tables under a metal shelter. There were no other amenities, no vending machines or information boards. But it would serve their purpose. Ralph pulled into the parking lot and immediately noticed they were not alone. An RV was parked at the far end of the lot, away from the restrooms. It was an older model, white with brown trim, the kind that had been popular in the 80s or 90s. The windows had curtains drawn across them, and there was no indication whether anyone was inside. Ralph parked near the restrooms, and both men got out to stretch. Lester headed immediately for the bathroom, while Ralph walked over to one of the picnic tables and checked his phone. No service, as expected out here. He walked back toward the truck, rolling his shoulders to work out the stiffness. That was when he heard it. A child crying. The sound was faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the RV. Ralph stopped and listened. Yes, definitely a child. The crying was desperate, panicked, the kind of sound that immediately triggers concern in any decent person. Ralph looked at the RV more closely. There was still no movement, no sign of adults. Just that crying, continuing without pause. Ralph walked slowly toward the RV, uncertain what to do. Maybe the parents were inside and did not realize how distressed their child sounded. Or maybe something was wrong. When Ralph was about 20 feet away, the crying stopped abruptly. Complete silence. Ralph paused, waiting. Nothing. He took a few more steps closer and called out, asking if everything was all right. No response. Lester emerged from the restroom and saw Ralph standing near the RV. He called out, asking what was going on. Ralph explained about the crying. Lester walked over to join him, and they both stood there, staring at the RV, unsure how to proceed. Ralph decided to knock on the door. He walked up the steps and rapped his knuckles against the metal frame. The sound echoed in the quiet evening. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the door opened. A man stood in the doorway. He was in his 40s, average height and build, wearing jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. His face was completely expressionless, showing no surprise or curiosity about why strangers were knocking on his door. He just stared at Ralph, waiting. Ralph felt immediately uncomfortable, but he pressed on. He explained that he had heard a child crying and wanted to make sure everything was okay. The man continued to stare for a moment, then said flatly that everything was fine. His voice was monotone, devoid of emotion. Ralph said he was certain he had heard crying, a child in distress. The man repeated that everything was fine. Then he said there was no child. Ralph felt confusion wash over him. He knew what he had heard. He insisted that he had clearly heard a child crying inside the RV just minutes ago. The man's expression did not change. He simply said again that there was no child and began to close the door. Ralph stepped back, glancing at Lester. Lester shrugged, looking equally confused. They had both heard the crying. How could the man claim there was no child? Ralph and Lester walked back toward their truck, talking in low voices. Something was wrong with that situation. The man's behavior was bizarre, and the crying had been too real, too desperate to ignore. They debated what to do. Should they call the police? But they had no cell service. Should they try talking to the man again? But what would that accomplish if he was just going to deny everything? As they stood there debating, Ralph made a decision. He told Lester to wait by the truck, and he walked back to the RV. This time he did not knock. He tried the door handle. It turned. The door was unlocked. Ralph pushed it open slowly and called out, announcing himself. No one answered. Ralph climbed the steps and looked inside the RV. What he saw made his blood run cold. The RV was completely empty. Not just empty of people, but empty of everything. No furniture, no bedding, no personal belongings. The interior had been stripped bare. Just metal walls, a bare floor, and empty cabinets with their doors hanging open. But there was a smell. Something foul and organic, like rotting meat left in the sun. The smell was so strong that Ralph had to cover his nose. He backed out of the RV quickly, his mind racing. Where had the man gone? Ralph had been watching the RV the entire time. No one had left, yet it was now completely empty. Ralph jumped down from the RV and nearly ran back to where Lester was standing. He described what he had seen, his voice shaking. Lester looked at the RV, then back at Ralph. He said they needed to leave immediately and report this to the police as soon as they had cell service. Ralph agreed. They both got in the truck, and Ralph started the engine. As he began to back out of the parking space, Lester grabbed his arm and pointed. The man from the RV was standing outside now, next to the vehicle. Ralph had not seen him exit. One moment the area had been empty, the next the man was just standing there. The man was staring directly at them, not moving, not approaching, just watching. And his expression was no longer blank. He was smiling. It was not a friendly smile. It was something else entirely, something that made Ralph's skin crawl. Ralph did not hesitate. He threw the truck into drive and floored the accelerator, kicking up gravel as they sped out of the rest area. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Ralph kept checking his rearview mirror, half expecting to see the RV following them, but the road behind remained empty. They drove for nearly an hour before they reached an area with cell service. Ralph pulled over, and they both tried to process what had happened. Lester called the police and reported the incident, providing as much detail as he could about the location of the rest area. The dispatchers said they would send someone to investigate. Ralph and Lester continued on to Las Vegas, but the experience had cast a shadow over their trip. They could not stop talking about it, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. The crying child, the man's bizarre behavior, the empty RV, the terrible smell, and the fact that the man had somehow vanished and reappeared without either of them seeing him move. 2 days later, Lester received a call from the Nevada State Police. They had investigated the rest area. There was no RV, no evidence that one had been there, no tire tracks, no trash, nothing. The officers said the rest area was rarely used and appeared undisturbed. Ralph and Lester were stunned. They knew what they had seen. They knew what had happened. But according to the police, there was no evidence to support their story. The officers suggested that perhaps they had stopped at a different rest area and were confused about the location. But Ralph knew exactly where they had been. He could describe every detail of that parking lot. In the weeks that followed, Ralph researched missing children in Nevada. He found several cases, some going back decades. He wondered if the crying he had heard was connected to one of those cases. He wondered what had been inside that RV, what the smell had been. And he wondered about the man, who he was and what he had been doing there. Ralph never got answers. The case, if it could even be called that, went nowhere. But Ralph could not forget. He still hears that crying sometimes, late at night when he cannot sleep. And he wonders if he could have done more, if he should have insisted on searching that RV more thoroughly, if he missed a chance to help someone who desperately needed it. The uncertainty haunts him more than anything else. Not knowing what really happened in that rest area. Not knowing if there was truly a child in danger. Not knowing who or what that man was. Ralph still takes road trips, but he never stops at isolated rest areas anymore. And he always trusts his instincts when something feels wrong. Chester and his wife Dorothy had always dreamed of visiting Yellowstone National Park. After years of postponing the trip due to work obligations and family commitments, they finally decided to make it happen. They planned a 2-week journey from their home in Illinois, driving west through the heartland and into Montana before reaching the park. The trip had been wonderful so far. They had stopped at Mount Rushmore, explored the Badlands, and spent a night in a charming bed and breakfast in South Dakota. By the time they entered Montana, they were both feeling relaxed and happy, enjoying the open roads and stunning scenery. They were using a GPS navigation system that Chester had purchased specifically for the trip. It was supposed to have the most up-to-date maps and would automatically route them around traffic. Chester had become quite dependent on it, trusting its directions without question. Dorothy had suggested bringing paper maps as backup, but Chester had dismissed the idea as unnecessary. Technology, he insisted, had made paper maps obsolete. On their 8th day of travel, they were driving through a particularly remote area of Montana. The landscape was beautiful but desolate, with rolling hills covered in grass and scattered pine trees. They had not seen another vehicle in over an hour. The GPS suddenly announced that it had found a faster route that would save them 35 minutes. Chester, eager to reach their destination before dark, accepted the alternate route without hesitation. The GPS directed them to turn off the main highway onto a smaller road. At first, the road was paved and in decent condition. Dorothy commented that it seemed fine, and Chester felt vindicated in trusting the technology. But after about 15 minutes, the pavement ended and the road became gravel. Then the gravel became dirt. And then the dirt road became increasingly rough and narrow. Chester began to feel uneasy, but the GPS insisted they were on the correct route. The computerized voice calmly announced each upcoming turn, and the screen showed a clear path ahead. So Chester kept driving, navigating the increasingly difficult terrain. Dorothy suggested they turn around, but Chester pointed out that the road was too narrow. There was nowhere to turn around safely. They would have to keep going forward until they found a wider spot. 20 minutes later, the GPS signal disappeared entirely. The screen went blank, then displayed an error message indicating it had lost satellite connection. Chester felt his stomach sink. They were on a barely passable dirt track in the middle of nowhere with no GPS and no idea where they were going. Dorothy pulled out her phone to try to get directions, but there was no cellular service. Chester checked his phone as well. Nothing. They were completely cut off from any form of electronic communication or navigation. Chester kept driving, hoping the road would eventually connect to something recognizable. But the track only seemed to get worse. They came to a fork in the road with no signs indicating which direction to take. Chester chose the left path, reasoning that it looked slightly more traveled. This turned out to be a mistake. The road deteriorated further, becoming rutted and overgrown with vegetation scraping against the sides of the car. Chester was now driving at barely 10 miles per hour, carefully maneuvering around rocks and holes. The sun was getting lower in the sky. Dorothy checked the time. It was nearly 7 in the evening. In another hour, it would be dark, and they still had no idea where they were or how to get back to civilization. The fuel gauge showed they had less than a quarter of a tank remaining. If they did not find a way out soon, they would be stranded. They drove for another 30 minutes and arrived at what appeared to be an abandoned homestead. There were several collapsed wooden structures, rusted farm equipment scattered around, and the remnants of old fencing. But no people, no working buildings. Nothing that could help them. It was a dead end. Chester carefully turned the car around, a process that took several minutes in the narrow space. They headed back to the fork and took the other path. This route was no better. It wound through increasingly dense forest, the trees pressing in close on both sides. Branches scraped against the car, and Dorothy winced at each scraping sound, imagining the damage to the paint. As darkness fell, Chester turned on the headlights. The beams illuminated the narrow tunnel of trees ahead, making everything beyond the immediate path disappear into blackness. The isolation felt oppressive. They had not seen a single person, vehicle, or structure in over 2 hours. Dorothy was fighting to keep panic at bay, but her hands were trembling. Then Chester saw something that made his heart race. Up ahead, blocking the entire width of the road, was a large fallen tree trunk, or rather, what appeared to be a deliberately placed tree trunk. It was positioned too perfectly to be natural, lying perpendicular to the road as if someone had dragged it there. Chester stopped the car about 20 feet from the obstruction. He and Dorothy sat in silence, staring at the tree. There was no way around it. The forest was too thick on both sides, and the car could not possibly navigate over it. Chester would have to move it by hand if they wanted to continue. But something about the situation felt wrong. The tree was large and heavy. It would have taken considerable effort to place it across the road. Why would anyone do that? And more troublingly, where were they now? Chester told Dorothy to stay in the car and keep the doors locked. He got out, leaving the engine running and the headlights on. He approached the tree trunk cautiously, scanning the dark forest around him. The silence was absolute except for the idling engine. No birds, no insects, nothing. Chester grabbed one end of the trunk and tried to lift it. It was extremely heavy, but he managed to shift it slightly. He would need to drag it rather than lift it. He braced himself and pulled hard. The trunk moved a few inches. He pulled again. That was when he heard something. Movement in the trees to his right. Not the sound of wind or small animals. Heavy footsteps. More than one set. Chester froze, his heart pounding. He peered into the darkness, but could see nothing beyond the reach of the headlights. The footsteps came closer. Chester abandoned the tree trunk and ran back to the car. He threw himself into the driver's seat and slammed the door, immediately hitting the lock button. Dorothy was wide-eyed with fear, asking what he had heard. Chester did not answer. He threw the car into reverse. Backing up in the dark on a narrow forest road was terrifying. Chester could barely see where he was going, relying on brief glances in the rearview mirror and the faint red glow of the taillights. But he did not care about caution anymore. He just needed to get away from that tree and whatever was moving in the forest. He reversed for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few hundred yards. Then he found a spot where the road was slightly wider, and he managed a clumsy multi-point turn. Once the car was facing forward, he accelerated as fast as he dared. The car bounced violently over the rough terrain, and Dorothy braced herself against the dashboard. But Chester did not slow down. They retraced their route, taking every turn they remembered in reverse order. Chester was operating on pure adrenaline now, his only thought to escape this wilderness. The fuel gauge was dangerously low, the warning light glowing a steady orange. Chester prayed the gas would hold out. After nearly an hour of frantic driving, they emerged onto a paved road. Chester could have cried with relief. He did not recognize the road, but it was paved and had lane markings, which meant they were back in civilization. He chose a direction at random and drove until they saw lights in the distance. They found a small town and pulled into the first gas station they saw. Chester filled the tank with shaking hands, while Dorothy went inside to ask for directions. The attendant looked at them with concern and asked if they were all right. Dorothy explained that they had gotten lost on back roads and had a frightening experience. The attendant asked where they had been. Dorothy described the area as best she could. The attendant's expression grew serious. He said that area was known to be dangerous, that there were people living back in those woods who did not want outsiders around. He said they were lucky to have found their way out, that others had gone missing in that region over the years. Chester and Dorothy got directions to the nearest highway and continued to Yellowstone, but the experience had shaken them both deeply. They never relied solely on GPS again. Dorothy bought several paper maps, and Chester learned to check routes carefully before blindly following technology. And they never took unmarked roads through isolated areas, no matter how much time the GPS claimed it would save. The memory of those footsteps in the dark forest stayed with Chester. He still wonders who or what was moving through those trees, and what would have happened if he had not heard them in time. Vernon had promised his mother, Irene, and his Aunt Ruth that he would drive them from Tennessee to Florida for a family reunion. Both women were in their 70s and could no longer manage long drives themselves. Vernon was happy to help, taking a week off work to make the trip leisurely and comfortable for them. They planned to drive down over 2 days, stopping overnight at a motel halfway through the journey. They left Knoxville early on a Monday morning. Vernon drove carefully, making frequent stops so the women could stretch their legs and use the restroom. Both Irene and Ruth were in good spirits, excited about seeing family members they had not visited in years. The conversation was light and cheerful as they made their way south through Georgia. By late afternoon, they had crossed into Florida. Vernon suggested they start looking for a place to stay for the night. They were not particular about accommodations, just somewhere clean and safe. Ruth spotted a sign advertising a budget motel just off the interstate. The price was reasonable, and Vernon decided to check it out. The motel was exactly what they expected from a budget establishment. A 2-story building with exterior corridors, about 30 rooms total, and a small office near the entrance. The parking lot was mostly empty, with only 4 or 5 other vehicles scattered around. Vernon parked near the office and went inside to book a room. The clerk was a thin man in his 20s, who seemed more interested in his phone than in helping customers. He barely looked up as Vernon requested a room on the ground floor to make it easier for his elderly relatives. The clerk handed over a key card and mumbled the room number. Vernon paid cash and returned to the car. Their room was on the far end of the building, away from the office. Vernon did not particularly like the location, but he reasoned that it would be quieter. He helped his mother and aunt carry their overnight bags inside. The room was basic but clean, with 2 double beds and a small bathroom. Irene declared it perfectly adequate, and Ruth agreed. They decided to rest for a bit before finding somewhere to eat dinner. Vernon took a quick shower while the women watched television. By the time they were ready to leave, it was nearly 9 in the evening. They found a family restaurant a few miles down the road and had a pleasant meal before returning to the motel around 10:30. The parking lot seemed even emptier than before. Vernon noticed that one of the vehicles that had been there earlier was gone, and a new one had appeared. A dark sedan parked several spaces away from their room. Vernon saw someone sitting in the driver's seat, the interior dark except for the faint glow of a phone or tablet screen. Vernon helped his mother and aunt back to their room and made sure they were settled. He told them to keep the door locked and use the chain. Both women assured him they would be fine, and Vernon retired to his own room next door. He was exhausted from the long day of driving and fell asleep quickly. He woke suddenly around midnight to a strange sound. At first, he could not identify it, his mind foggy with sleep. Then he realized someone was trying to open his door, not knocking, but manipulating the handle and lock. Vernon sat up in bed, his heart immediately racing. He stared at the door in the darkness, seeing the handle move slightly. Vernon got out of bed as quietly as possible and crept toward the door. He looked through the peephole. A man was standing outside, bent over the lock, using some kind of tool to try to pick it. Vernon could only see the top of his head and his hands working at the mechanism. Vernon shouted through the door that he was calling the police. The man immediately stopped and ran. Vernon heard rapid footsteps retreating along the exterior corridor. He rushed to the window and pulled back the curtain just in time to see a figure disappearing around the corner of the building. Vernon grabbed his phone and tried calling the front desk. The phone rang and rang with no answer. He cursed and dialed 911 instead. The dispatcher answered, and Vernon quickly explained the situation. The dispatcher said police were on their way, but it would take approximately 20 minutes as they were coming from the county seat. Vernon hung up and immediately went to check on his mother and aunt next door. He knocked and identified himself. Ruth opened the door, looking worried. She said they had heard running footsteps outside but had not known what was happening. Vernon quickly explained and told them to barricade the door with furniture. He helped them push the dresser in front of the door, then returned to his own room to do the same. Vernon stood near his window, watching the parking lot. The dark sedan that had been there earlier was still present, but he could no longer see anyone inside it. 5 minutes passed. Then Vernon heard something that made his blood run cold. Breaking glass, coming from his mother and aunt's room. Vernon ran out of his room and saw that someone was trying to break in through their bathroom window. The window was small and high up, but an arm was reaching through, trying to unlock it from the inside. Vernon could hear his mother screaming. Vernon ran to their door and pounded on it, shouting for them to move away from the bathroom. He heard the dresser being pushed aside, and Ruth opened the door. Vernon rushed inside and grabbed a lamp from the nightstand. He ran to the bathroom just as the intruder managed to unlock the window and began pulling himself through. Vernon brought the lamp down hard on the arm, reaching through the window. The intruder screamed and pulled back violently. Vernon heard cursing and the sound of someone falling. He looked out the window and saw a man scrambling to his feet and running toward the parking lot. The dark sedan's engine started immediately, and Vernon realized there were at least 2 people involved in this attack. Vernon heard sirens in the distance. The police were close. The sedan peeled out of the parking lot and sped away. Vernon stood there shaking, still holding the broken lamp. His mother was sitting on one of the beds, crying. Ruth was trying to comfort her, but looked equally traumatized. 2 police cars arrived moments later. Vernon met the officers outside and gave a detailed account of what had happened. The officers inspected both rooms, took photographs of the attempted break-in points, and called for additional units to search the area for the sedan. One of the officers explained that this particular motel had been the target of multiple robbery attempts over the past 6 months. The criminals specifically targeted elderly travelers, getting information from the clerk about which rooms they were in and when they checked in. The officer said the motel manager was suspected of being complicit, possibly receiving a cut of whatever the robbers stole. Vernon was furious. He demanded to know why the motel was still operating if police knew it was a target for criminals. The officer said they had been building a case, but needed to catch the perpetrators in the act. Tonight's incident would help, especially since Vernon and his family could provide detailed statements and there was evidence of forced entry. The police arranged for Vernon, Irene, and Ruth to move to a different hotel for the remainder of the night. They provided an escort to make sure the family arrived safely. The new hotel was more expensive, but far more secure. With interior corridors and 24-hour security, none of them slept well for the remainder of the night. Vernon kept replaying the events in his mind, thinking about how much worse it could have been. If he had not woken up when the first man tried his door, if he had not checked on his mother and aunt, if the police had taken longer to arrive, the outcome could have been tragic. They continued to Florida the next day as planned, but the joy had gone out of the trip. Irene was shaken and kept asking why anyone would want to hurt elderly people who had so little. Ruth was angry, feeling violated by the attack. Vernon felt guilty for having chosen that motel, even though he had no way of knowing it was a target for criminals. Several weeks later, Vernon received a call from the Florida police. They had arrested 3 men in connection with a string of motel robberies. The clerk at the motel where Vernon had stayed was also arrested for conspiracy. Evidence linked the group to at least 8 other attacks, 2 of which had resulted in serious injuries to the victims. Vernon was relieved that the criminals had been caught, but the experience changed how he approached travel. He researched accommodations thoroughly before booking, read reviews carefully, and always chose well-lit rooms near the office or security. He installed security devices on the doors whenever they stayed anywhere. And he never again underestimated how vulnerable travelers could be when they were far from home. The memory of that night stayed with all 3 of them. Irene still struggles with anxiety when staying in unfamiliar places. Ruth refuses to stay in budget motels. And Vernon carries the knowledge that vigilance and quick thinking likely saved them from becoming victims of a violent crime.